Hello everyone, this is Al-Fadi and I'd like to welcome you back to this new series about Ahruf and Qira'at controversy. And last time we gave you an overview of what this particular video series is going to cover, and Dr. J. Smith did an excellent job as always to walk us through point by point about the issues that we are going to raise throughout this series, not necessarily just in one episode or not necessarily in today's episode, but we don't know yet how long really it's going to take us to unpack all of these points. But today we are going to focus our attention in what we call the presuppositions. Dr. J, as always, thank you so much for being here with us. I want to start by asking this. What is the Islamic presupposition? But before that, what is the presupposition you are bringing with you?
Okay, there are two different viewpoints, and they're really two different worlds. And the Islamic presupposition, I would suggest, is not just the Islamic presupposition, it's the only presupposition that's out there. All the training that I've had, all the Muslims that I could talk with, even all of the secular world or the Christian world in the seminaries and the Bible schools, they come with this supposition that what we're reading about Muhammad, what we're reading about the Quran, is historical. These did happen. There was a man named Muhammad who was born in 570, started receiving revelations in 610, and then died in 632, lived in two different cities, Mecca and Medina, and moved in 622, and they are two completely different halves of the Quran that were revealed in those two cities, and everything he said, everything he did is verbatim historical. That's all that we've ever been given. That's the only narrative that exists. That's the only narrative that we're permitted to use, because that's the only narrative that has been passed down. Muslims tell us 1400 years.
Right.
The problem is it's not 1400 years old. That narrative was not written down in the 7th century. It was not even written down in the 8th century. It doesn't even get written down until the 9th and 10th century, 200 to 300 years later, written, as we well know, by Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. Muhammad died in 632. There's 200 years between Muhammad's death and Ibn Hisham's death, and yet he's the first one to write down the biography of Muhammad. Al-Bukhari comes after him. He died about 835, and those are the two biographies we use today. Now, they get it from Ibn Ishaq, but he died in 765. The problem is we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. We're only dependent on what Ibn Hisham retained or what he threw out and he did not like. So we have to really say it's Ibn Hisham's material that gives us that life of Muhammad, the biography, the Sirah. But as far as the sayings, remember the sayings are the much more voluminous. You have to go to Al-Bukhari, who died in 870. 870, that's 240 years after Muhammad. So everything we know about what Muhammad did, everything we know about Muhammad said, comes from either Ibn Hisham or Al-Bukhari or Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, who come after Al-Bukhari. As far as the Quran itself, and as far as what it says and how we were to interpret it, that's the tafsir. That is not introduced till Al-Tabari introduces it in 923. That's 300 years later. The Tahriq, which would be the histories of all of mankind up until Muhammad, comes and is introduced by Al-Tabari. And everything that we now know about how to interpret the Quran or how the history is considered, that comes after 923. So 200 to 300 years later. If that's the only narrative that's out there, you're going to then come and look at the material that we're going to introduce, and you're going to try to interpret it from that narrative. And that's the conundrum right there.
And what I want to just simplify for people, the initial classical, traditional presupposition that every Muslim in the world, like myself when I was growing up, was told is that there is a Quran that was revealed in the 7th century. This Quran that was revealed back then is still the exact same Quran that we have today. It was compiled by Omar / Abu Bakr, and then later Uthman. And yes, it has 7 different readings, but it was endorsed by the Prophet, and so on and so forth.
And everything you've just said is from Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim,
which is
Ibn
later.
Dawud. Absolutely. And this is what most people aren't understanding. Can you imagine, as Christians, if we were to suggest that everything we know about Jesus Christ, what he said and what he did would be his biography, would be the Sirah of Jesus. What he said would be the Hadith of Jesus. We know that comes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the 4 Gospels that gives us his biography and what he did and what he said. Now, can you imagine if we had nothing from the time of Jesus's century, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not even appear till 200 years after. Right. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were from the 3rd century. not from the 1st century.
Yeah.
How would we defend him? And how could we say that we knew exactly what Jesus did or what he said if everything that we're dependent on came from 200 to 300 years later? Remember, the synoptic gospel, synoptic means eye, with eye. These are done with the eye, Coptic. The idea of the optic means you are eyewitnesses to that. And we do know that two of the gospel writers were eyewitnesses. Matthew and John were right there. They were with him for the last 3 years. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. They wrote down what they saw and heard. And then Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. And so you can see why, for us, that gives us a huge amount of confidence in the meritocracy of those writings. If that is the case for the Christians, why aren't we demanding the same thing of Islam? Why haven't we demanded an eyewitness account? Where is this eyewitness account? Where is this 7th century account? Nothing comes from the 7th century. Nothing comes from the 8th century. Oh, I'm going to change that. We're now saying we're now going to talk about the 8th century, but most everything comes from the 9th and 10th century. So depending on where your starting point is, if you start and believe that this 9th and 10th century is correct, then you're going to have to try to make sense of everything you're seeing in the 7th century, and it's just not going to work.
That's right. So you're doing reverse engineering if we follow the classical traditional approach.
Absolutely. And I remember for almost 20 to 30 years, back in the 1990s, when I was bringing this up, when I was studying under Dr. Gerald Hotting, and when I would introduce this whole historical critique, the same recurring response was, you're just talking out of our argument from silence.
Right.
So you can't find any reference to Muhammad. So you can't find any reference to the place called Mecca. So you can't find any reference to people called Muslims or a religion called Islam or a book called the Quran. Those are the 5 things we couldn't find in the 7th century. And they said, who cares? This is just an argument from silence, which is the weakest of all arguments. Now, that was in 1995, 25 years ago, that was a problem for me. And it wasn't until really the last few, probably 2 to 3 years, where you had Dan Gibson, start coming up with all these qiblas that were not facing Mecca, and that all the qiblas were facing Petra up until 706, and that the first qibla that even begins to face Mecca is not till 727, and Muhammad died in 632, and the qibla was canonized in 625, 624, 625. So you're talking about 100 years after the canonization of the qibla, the first mosque is facing Mecca. Suddenly the world woke up and said, hold on a minute, the evidence from the 7th century does not support what we're seeing in the 9th and 10th century. And that was the first time that someone like Dan Gibson could say, we're not arguing from silence anymore. You're arguing from silence. That your material from the 9th and 10th century is now based on a supposition where there's no evidence to support it. You are also assuming that which you cannot support. We're now going to the 7th century, and we're now bringing up and saying that this is not the evidence we see on the ground. And then this year, in January of this year, Hutton, well, actually it was in December of last year, Hutton and I were there in the British Museum, and we came across the coins. And we looked and we saw a coin that was supposedly with the Shahada on it that was attributed to Muawiyah in 661. And we said, hold on a minute, you can't have the Shahada in 661. That's only introduced by Abd al-Malik in 692. And so we went back and we started getting in contact with the numismatists, these experts in coins, and we were looking at their narrative, and they were finding coin after coin after coin from 630s, 640s, up until 661, and then from 661 up until 680, and these coins all had crosses on them. Yet they were all Arab, and they were from the same area.
Right.
Where Muhammad should have lived, and where Abu Bakr should have lived, and Umar should have lived, and Uthman should have lived, and also Ali, the 4 rightly guided caliphs. And yet they couldn't find any reference to these 4 caliphs on any of the coins. And all the coins that were in the Western Hemisphere around the Mediterranean had crosses on them. And all the coins that were in the Eastern Hemisphere from the Sassanid area all had Zoroastrian fire altars, which means these Arabs here were Zoroastrian, and these Arabs here were Christians.
Right.
There was nothing Islamic on these coins. That's evidence, because coins they don't deteriorate, they don't disintegrate. They're probably the best evidence you can get, because coins are always minted by the caliphs. They're minted by the kings. They're minted to introduce themselves. That's why.
And they're proud to put their faces there, their names, or anything that they're passionate about.
You have to do that, because that's the only way in the 7th century to introduce who you are when you're a new king. You don't have radio, you don't have television, you don't have internet, you don't even have newspapers, but you have coins. And so those coins are probably the best index we have as to what was happening in the 7th century, and we could not not find any of the 5 things we were looking for. We could not find reference to Muhammad. We couldn't find any reference to any place called Mecca. We couldn't find any reference to any people called Muslims or a religion called Islam or any book called the Quran on any of the coins. That's why we turned around and said, hold on a minute, we've got the evidence now. Muslims, you're still talking from your presuppositional base, which is based on these traditions from 9th and 10th century, redacted back onto the 7th century, yet here we're looking at coins that don't support anything you're saying. Now who's arguing from silence?
Right.
You are arguing from silence. No longer are we arguing from silence. Now we're going to come to the Qira'at, because the Qira'at has absolute importance if you put it on a timeline. You're going to see why this is important. So far, everything we're going to hear about these ahruf and these Qira'at, about how the Quran was put together, is from the 9th and 10th century traditions. And I'm going to keep reminding you, I'm going to keep reminding the audience, you people who are watching, I'm going to keep reminding you as well, I don't care about the 9th and 10th century. Don't waste my time for the 9th and 10th century. That's the wrong supposition. You're starting from the wrong starting point. Bring me to the 7th century. Prove what you say. Show me a Quran from the 7th century. Show me these 7 Qira'ah from the 7th century. These ones that were introduced by Jibril. I'm going to keep coming back to that supposition because my presupposition is I want history to tell me. I don't want to have the traditions tell me what I'm to believe.
And what you're saying is, as a detective, let's say, follow the evidence and do a forensic search and start from when the event supposedly happened.
Absolutely.
I mean, if there's a crime, folks, and I don't mean anything by mentioning the word crime here, but let's say there is a crime, you don't expect detectives to come back to you and say, well, 30 years later, we discover this that proves to us now that this happened earlier and this is why. No court will accept these kind of things. They'll say, well, you found it 30 years later, and it doesn't even come close to approving what was taking place at that time. When you find evidence at that crime scene, that's what would be accepted, or evidence around the crime scene at the same time, it will be accepted. That's what Jay is talking about. Imagine we come to you as a Muslim and say, I can prove to you Jesus existed because so-and-so who existed 300 years after the time of Jesus told me that Jesus lived. You're not going to accept my argument. You're going to laugh at me. You're already laughing at me when I tell you about Jesus and all the internal and external evidence that exists because you feel like, oh, it's still not exactly at the time of Jesus, when in fact we can prove that. Now put yourself in our position. Ibn Hisham, 200 years after the time of Muhammad. Bukhari, 240 years after the time of Muhammad. Ibn Mujahid, who decided which 7 canonical readings could be used, 300 years after the time the Quran was revealed. You get the picture? You get the idea?
Let's go one step further. Yeah. Al-Jazari, who then introduces the other 3, which makes it 10.
1,400 years?
1429, that's 800 years. 1429 is 15th century. Yeah. That's almost 800 years after Muhammad, and no one has looked, and we're going to do that. We're going to look on a timeline to show you that. But one more thing before we end this episode, because it's about presupposition. The whole idea of looking at a text, what we know as textual criticism, starts from the premise that you always, when you have a new manuscript, when you have a new piece of writing, when you have a new parchment or a new piece of vellum that has been discovered, what do? You open it up and you read it and you look and see whether or not it corresponds with the oldest text. You always start with the oldest text. We had to do that with the Bible.
Exactly.
Remember, we had the Latin Vulgates, and that was really, everybody assumed the Latin Vulgates were the best until the Greek manuscripts.
By Jerome, exactly.
And when the Greek manuscripts started to appear in the 1800s, the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Vaticanus, we saw that there were differences between that and the Latin Vulgate, and so we've now used the Greek manuscripts as our
why? Because it takes us back to close to the action.
It's the closest to the action, and that's what you always do with historical criticism, and that's what we did with the Bible. That has not been done with the Quran, and we're going to show you how hopeless a canonical process was used. That's yet to come. We're going to show you that nobody yet today has done what they've done with the Quran, what we have done with the Bible, and that's one reason it's almost laughable when you see how these Qurans that we're going to see, that you see right here on the wait till you see how they were chosen. That had nothing to do with textual criticism, had nothing to do with any reference to what was inside those pages, and the reason why is because they started from the wrong supposition. The supposition they were more interested was popularity and geography, not textual critical analysis.
We'll deal with that when it's time for us to discuss this. What do you think is the next order of things that we will be
What I like to
exposing our
do is I
listeners
like to say, I like to first, and this is a great segue, because the next one we're going to look at is, why is it the Muslims are saying what they're saying? Why is it they have to say what they're saying? And the reason why, we're going to wait till the next episode to show you why.
Wonderful. Thank you as always. Thank you everyone for being here with us. Until next time, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel CIRA International. Also click on the bell so that you can receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or we go live. And I would like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking on the link right below, and that way you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you on how you can give to our channel. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.